Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for the webinar reference content migration. My name's Darren. I guess I've been tasked today with walking you through some of the circumstances and processes relating to migration. As we go through the webinar, what I'll get everyone to do is just submit their questions via the GoToWebinar app. I'll do my best to answer those on the way through, and if I can't get to any of those, I'll come back to you post the session. Before we start, I guess I'll just talk a little bit about how this webinar came about. Over the course of the last sort of 12 plus months, we've been having numerous conversations with clients around content migration. That's predominantly been driven by clients looking to move from existing or legacy network file shares into the cloud. Be that Office 365 focused, but also clients looking at box.com and a number of other cloud repositories. So it's meant that we've had a lot of conversations around the best way to move, our approach to moving, and then also given that we've got a records management background, some of the governance and compliance requirements. But I think it'd be fair to say from my perspective in talking to a number of those clients, sometimes network file shares can be the Wild West. You don't really know what's in there, and there's a lot of duplicate information and other issues that come along with migrating that content. So what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to look at the focuses and challenges when migrating, some of the key steps in migration, some simple ways which you can unlock value of your content. And I've underlined the word simple there because no migration is really simple. But I guess after having done a whole host of these migrations, we've found ways to simplify the process. And then some considerations to your approach or some takeaways for you to think about if you're looking at undertaking a migration. Migration, as I said, can be quite a complex topic. It can be highly technical. So for today's webinar, I want to look at it sort of through the following lens. I want to focus on the content and unlocking its value. I want to take a non-technical perspective. So if you've come to this webinar wanting to know all the ins and outs of the technical aspects of migration, then unfortunately you're probably not going to get what you need, but I'm happy to answer those questions afterwards. And whilst a lot of what we talk about today applies for migration between records management systems or other repositories, I'm going to sort of focus a little bit on network file shares as the primary example. Before we start, I want to have just a quick chat about why McTish increased its focus on migration over the last sort of 2 years, and why we wanted to sort of design a better way for migration. Historically, a lot of our migrations have been during the creation or the implementation of new EDRMS, and like I say, nowadays it's moved to be more moving content to the cloud and then having an EDRMS manage in place. But I guess the key thing for us is we believe that in the migration aspect of sort of the IT space or industry, there was far too much focus on the tech and not enough focus on the information itself. You know, to paint a picture of that, little I, small t. And this was dominating, I guess, the focus, the view, the approach, and the conversation around migration. Our belief is it should have been the other way around. The focus should have been on the actual information that you are moving to the new target system, and less focus on the actual tech itself. The other thing that we noticed is the majority of the energy was actually being put into the movement of the content, and I guess that aligns to what I was saying about the technology, and I think that probably comes from the definition of content migration or even migration itself. You know, the process of moving content from one system to another. So when we talk about migration, that always tends to be the default thing that everyone is looking at. As I looked at that definition and I looked a little bit further into the general definition of migration, I think a more appropriate definition, whilst focused on people, is the movement of people, or let's call it content, to a new area or country in order to find better work or living conditions. And I guess that's really what we focus on when we're looking at moving content, is how do we make that content work more effectively for us, and how do we get it in a better condition for the end user? So when we sort of embarked on finding a new way to migration and looking at new tooling and trying to automate the process a couple of years ago, we wanted to do a couple of things. We wanted to provide an end-to-end service where clients didn't have to engage consultants, buy software separately, look to pay for software that may be used for a one-off migration. We wanted to focus on connecting end users to that information. We had a solid focus on trying to improve the information architecture in the new target systems, especially when moving from a network file share to the likes of, say, SharePoint Online, where the functionality around the management, control, governance, and searchability of the information improves dramatically with the ability to add metadata, etc. We obviously wanted the approach to be, a secure and accurate migration for obvious reasons. As I discussed before, we wanted to minimize the distraction from tech. So we wanted to take away the heavy lifting from the technical coding perspective. And again, because we've got a records management background, we wanted to be able to enhance regulatory compliance. One of the major pain points in the records management space is end users not putting records into the EDRMS or the records management system. In a lot of circumstances that we saw, network file shares and other repositories became the dumping ground for a lot of that information. So part of this process was to work out how we could find that important and high value content and then get it in the appropriate system or manage it appropriately in accordance with records management requirements. So let's talk about migration challenges really quickly. There are a whole heap of migration challenges that need to be considered. You'll hear some of the examples on screen. But given that we wanted to put the focus on the content itself rather than the technological challenges, the first step that we took was to minimize as many of those technical barriers or challenges we could. And we did that by creating a suite of connectors. So, vast majority of the systems now have an open API that can be accessed. Typically, when undertaking a migration, a lot of the focus can go into making those systems connect or talk to each other. So we believe that the easiest way to do this was to create a set of connectors to enable us to bring the information more seamlessly between systems. That removed for us the vast majority of the coding required when needing to move content between systems, and as I say, it minimized that technical distraction and allows us to spend time with the clients and allows the client to spend time focusing on the actual content itself. So all that being said, there's a bit of background. Let's now take a look at the content migration process. The typical migration process, and this may not be new news for a lot of you on the webinar today, is the ETL process. So the extract, transform, and load process. It's fairly simplistic. There's a lot of technical detail that goes underneath that in terms of test migrations and audit logs and a whole raft of other things. But at the highest level, that's the process that typically gets followed from an IT perspective. Our preference when looking at the migration is to place more focus on the content, and the way we talk about it is enriching the content. So we focus, or we add another step to the front of that, which is that more of an analysis phase, and that's a combination of analysis from a technical perspective, but also engagement with the business itself to understand the information and the content and the value of that content. So given that we've sort of created some processes and some technology to make it easier to connect those systems, really the focus becomes on the analyze and enrich or transform. And I've added the word enrich there because that's the goal here. We want to be able to drive more value for the end user from the existing content. So in essence, unlocking the value of the content that already lives within your existing repositories. So the goal here for the migration is not actually to move the content. Whilst that happens, and I think that's pretty obvious that that's got to happen as part of the process, we want to make sure that the goal is to make it easier for end users to find, access, and use relevant content. And what I often talk about with clients is to be able to stitch content together, so it's not separate bits of information and content, but it sort of becomes knowledge. So we're tying that information together, and I guess removing those traditional information silos that tend to be in a network file share. You've got finance storing content and documents related to a project in the finance section, and then you've got potentially an operations team storing documents related to the same project in a separate area, and the two can't be brought together just purely to the technical limitations of a traditional network file share. So let's take a look at analysis for a second. From our perspective, or the more basics around the analysis section traditionally have been to look at things like file size, file type, date created, date last modified, all the basic stuff that comes out of a network file share. There's often talk about deduplication, and I've put in brackets there MD5 hash, and for those that don't know what an MD5 hash is, it's basically a binary code or an algorithm that's run over a document, and each document or piece of content's being given a piece of code. And if you took two Word documents that were the same, they would have the same MD5 hash. So it's a fairly simple way, without doing a full index of the document, of trying to compare two pieces of content and identify if they're the same, and obviously use that to deduplicate the content. Vast majority of migration platforms, systems, or technology rely upon this to do what I would call simplistic deduplication. Also, traditionally, people are looking at the manual interpretation of the file name and folder structure to be able to understand the content where it lives. Whether it's human resources as an example, and you might have a folder in there called contracts. It's pretty obvious what should be living within that particular folder. From our perspective, what we would talk about in terms of value-driven analysis, and again, analysis in our view being one of the key parts of the data migration process, is to take a step back and actually look at what is of highest value to your organization. So, understand and engage your end users and understand what they really need and how long they need it for. What are they using the content for? For the records managers that are probably on the call, we often experience a disconnect between the creation of content, the utilization of content for the end user, and then how long we are required to keep it from a retention perspective. And that becomes important when considering a migration, because if we purely look at it from a records management perspective or a governance perspective, we may need to keep a whole heap of that information for, call it a 10, 15-year period. However, the end users don't need that in front of them on a day-to-day basis, which means when you're approaching a migration, you may decide based on age and relevance of the information to put information in different places. If we talk, say, network file share to SharePoint for a second, you may only move a percentage of the content into what I would say is an active repository that end users use versus a legacy section of that repository. So again, there's an engagement with the business here before the migration process even commences, and that's to understand what's of highest value, and then to start to think about what can you use that is already in your business to be able to identify content. Given that if we're living in network file share, we've only got date created, date modified, the folder it lives in, and depending on how your organisation has been structured and the discipline it's had in the past as to how well people have stuck to folder structures and classification schemes that have been put in the past. So I guess we then try and encourage clients to think about other things that may be able to be used to identify content. That could be things like project numbers, employee numbers, client names, asset IDs, legal clauses that live within contracts, as an example. What those particular triggers or identifiers are will be different for each client, but we spend a good amount of time with each client and encourage all of our clients to think about how would we find, if we could read every one of those documents, how would we go about identifying or classifying that content based on these key bits of information. The next thing from our perspective when looking to do good analysis for a content migration is to actually index the text within the document and go looking for the tags or triggers that assist you. So, our belief is you need to undertake a full index of all of your content rather than just looking at that MD5 hash, which is just a high level view of the document. Then what you can do is you can go looking through those documents as part of the process. You can go looking for those employee numbers or client names or, again, whatever is important. And as part of that process, then tag or attach to those documents or those pieces of content that metadata. So as an example, we might create a column or a metadata position against each piece of content for project number. And we read that document, we go looking for a set series of project numbers that you've provided, and then tag that content with the appropriate project number when we find it. Further to, I guess, a creation of metadata or tagging of content is also not to forget the information that can come from the file name or folder names. I guess one of the key tricks also is coming from a hierarchical structure like a network file share into what is more traditionally nowadays a flat information architecture in most of the webs or cloud-based systems. With the utilization of metadata, is you need to be able to turn that hierarchical structure and information that you can extract from it into a flat structure and turn, I guess, those folder names into, again, pieces of metadata that can be referenced to display information in a different way for your end users. And the last bit from our perspective on the visualize is then on the analysis, I should say, is to then visualize that data. Create some dashboards and see what content is there, and again socialize that back with the end users to get an understanding of what is valuable to them and what isn't. There's no point taking information or content with you that is not driving value. And again, there needs to be two trains of thought there. There needs to be trains of thought around what does the end user need to use, and then what do we need to retain from a records management and governance perspective. Once you've done that bit, we can then start to talk about the transformation piece. And from our perspective, the historic or more traditional migration approaches, the basics have been the obvious, mapping new location. And probably one of the key things that we see there is everyone tries to maintain a very similar structure to what they've had. They try to retain that hierarchical structure of classification of content or information as they move to these new cloud platforms. Everyone undertakes a deduplication, as I discussed before, generally based on an MD5 hash. If we talk about how we think that can be enhanced or how you unlock the value through this transformation process, it is the design of the new environment. The key thing we talk about is leveraging the technology and the functionality within that technology. If I talk more specifically, say around SharePoint Online as an example, it's taking the time to actually sort out your information architecture. Where do you need to be able to store information? Who needs to be able to access it? What's the metadata you require? And I guess it's not making it onerous on the end user to capture metadata, but just to capture the minimum metadata that's required to be able to drive not only governance and records management, but also search. We've moved from traditionally having very siloed access to information, and it's sort of share by exception, to we're now in a situation where we should be sharing by default, which means we need to think about how we structure these new cloud-based repositories, and that starts at information architecture, and how you're going to translate that information from the old structure to the new. And the key also off the back of the information architecture is defining the metadata term store. Again, SharePoint Online or SharePoint terminology there, and synonyms. So how are people going to refer to each of those things, so that when an end user is going to look for something or going to store something, they can use words that make sense to them, and that aligns back to your information architecture and I guess the metadata that you've got in your system. So, again, the focus tends to be on what the content is, and a lot of the emphasis needs to go on what's the design of the new system and how an end user is going to access and find that information. The next step, which is, we talked about in the analysis phase, is to enrich that content by adding those tags or adding that metadata. The ability to read some content, and by looking for a particular clause that is in every single one of your legal contracts, and also looking for a project number, you may, depending on what's in that content, be able to tag a document with, this is a legal contract and this relates to project XYZ, because you've taken the time to do a full text index of that document and effectively read it. It also means that we can do a full deduplication of that index and create links back to the content where needed. One of the key things is something like a basic deduplication with an MD5 hash is a Word document and a PDF of that exact Word document will have different MD5 hashes, so you will never deduplicate them. Whereas if you full index the document, you will actually pick up that they are different documents. The other key thing with this migration process, and we often see this, is you'll have the same piece of content stored in 3 or 4 different places. So you'll have the content store, you'll have a contract as an example stored in finance. You'll also have it stored in the legal section of network file share, and you'll also have it stored in the operations area or the projects area of the network file share, and that's purely because of that siloed approach. So I guess one of the key things with an intelligent migration is to understand that you have got duplicates of that information, and that 3 or 4 different departments may require that one document or that one piece of content. So we move the one piece of content and then place links in different parts of the system to enable different departments or stakeholders to be able to get to that one source document rather than having multiple copies of it. And I touched on this before. The other thing is to consider where content should reside. Not everything should go with you, and I mean, it's obvious to look at redundant, obsolete, and trivial data and duplication of data and just delete or remove that. But again, when you consider active content versus archive content, is what are the end users actually using right now, and should that all be stored, again as an example, in SharePoint Online, or should part of that content be moved into a records management system for archive purposes, and the rest of it be put, or the active content be put into, say, SharePoint Online? That was sort of a very quick and high-level overview of the focus that we think needs to be placed on both the analysis and the transformation or enrichment phases of a migration process. A couple of considerations I think that we need to discuss as well, which are things that I see out in the marketplace, and that is what I'll describe, or what we've just talked through there, is what I would describe as a semi-manual analysis of content. And then I get a lot of questions around, what about using machine learning? What about using artificial intelligence to undertake migration? in short, machine learning and artificial intelligence is a brilliant set of tooling. The challenges we see are it's costly, and no matter what anyone tells you, it takes a good chunk of time to be able to educate the machines, the algorithms, or the artificial intelligence. And given that, if we look at the value of content, we use the old 80-20 rule, given that 20% of that content is of high value and the other 80% is not of such high value, I often ask the question to say, do you really want to be expending a whole lot of time, energy, and effort educating a machine and some algorithms to pick up 20% of your content? In very loose terms, 80% of your energy and effort and cost is being focused on content that you may not require. It's not to say that machine learning and artificial intelligence isn't good. It's more a focus on, is it really required? Certainly from the migration activities that we've undertaken, through using some smarts around the approach to the migration, engaging with end users, you can find the vast majority, if not all, of your valuable content. We also talk to clients about things like leveraging open source technologies and platforms to keep costs down. I talked before about indexing all of the content that you have within your network file shares. When we are doing that, we use open source tools like Elasticsearch. Again, very powerful pieces of technology that are open to all. There's great technology that's embedded within Office 365 for those clients that are Microsoft clients in Office 365. So as you're looking to understand and unearth the value of this content, we often suggest that look at those open source technologies as a way of getting the intelligence you need, but also keeping the costs down. Along the short, I guess, of what we're talking about, whether we call it metadata or whatever we sort of term it, is we're talking about content classification. And one of the key conversations I have with clients ongoing is there's this upfront classification that we just talked about, moving a network file share into the cloud, understanding what the content is, classifying that content, and then putting it in the appropriate place. There's a lot of time, energy, and effort that can go into that. And then you've got to ask the question around, then what's required ongoing? And again, this ties back to the questions I get around machine learning and artificial intelligence that says, if I'm using machine learning and artificial intelligence, then, I don't really need my end users to do much and the machines will do all the work and classify the content. Well, that may be true. Again, there's a cost and an input that goes into maintaining those machine learning and artificial intelligence platforms and make sure that you're continually educating that they are classifying correctly. The converse to that is, if you've gone through, let's call this a semi-manual analysis of content, and you've identified those key things like client names and project numbers, etc., and you've designed a good cloud information architecture when you've looked at, say, setting up SharePoint Online or Box.com or one of the others, and then you've got your end users capturing just the key bits of metadata, the amount of content that you should have unclassified should be reduced. And you don't really need to put a huge impost on your end user to be able to grab critical bits of metadata that will enable you to easily classify content. As an example, and I always use this example, is if you're asking someone to save a contract and you're asking them for the start date and end date of that contract and potentially the value of the contract, most end users that have to save a contract as part of their role really won't object to giving you that information if you force that upon them when they're saving the content in the new system. And that's probably all you need to be able to classify that content correctly. We also need to think about when you move to these new cloud technologies and platforms, automatically content's indexed, so it makes it easier to be able to search. So there really has to be some thinking around how you're going to configure that new system and how you're going to drive search out of that new system which may mean that you don't have to go through this exercise of reclassification or content cleanup ever again. That should be the aim. And then there's the purchase of licensing versus as a service. Like I say, there's a couple of options here. We have had historically a number of clients that have purchased their own migration technology, or already have migration technology, and want to undertake that migration, the technical part of that migration themselves. The inverse of that is to engage someone to deliver it as a service. So you're not investing the money in the coding and the software to undertake a migration that, let's be honest, you really only have to do one or a couple of times, depending on whether you're taking a staggered approach to your migration or you're doing it all at once. So a couple of key takeaways from my perspective is you really want to understand the value of your content, work with your end users and understand what is important to them and also the business. Consider the compliance requirements, and again, they may be very different to what the end users require and how long they're required to keep content. You know, we term that so that the active versus archive content. Create metadata. This is the really key message and quite simplistic message. And you know, when thinking about doing a 30-minute webinar, I had to really think about how I expanded upon this one key point, because I could have spoken for 30 minutes about just talking about creating metadata. There's lots of knowledge in people's heads and within asset registers and like I say, employee numbers and project numbers that can be used to unlock the value of your information. The key thing is to be able to attach it to those pieces of content as metadata. You know, you think about the impact on that for an end user when they get into, again, as an example, SharePoint Online. I now go into search and I go search a project number. It's going to bring back all documentation related to that project, because we've taken the time to read all of that content and attach the project number where we've been able to find it. And think through the design of the new repository. I could not count the number of SharePoint implementations and other systems as well where the time hasn't been taken to configure things like the metadata term store, think about the information architecture, you know, and from my perspective, that's generally because we take that technological approach to software or to technology, and we roll out things like SharePoint without thinking about how the information's got to be structured and controlled ongoing. You know, the design of those new repositories really have to have the end user in mind. You know, with a good metadata and good information architecture, it will really make it easy for the end user and will make it give you more options and more flexibility in the design of your new user interface, and leverage and maintain metadata. You know, again, presenting views to individual groups or individual stakeholders based on their preference, rather than just giving everyone that traditional hierarchical structure. I haven't seen any questions come through. I'm hoping that we get some post the webinar, and I'll be happy to answer those. Look, I thank everyone for taking sort of 30 minutes of their time this morning to have a quick look at migration with me. As I said, it can be a really complex topic. Today, we were just trying to give you a taste for some of the simplistic things that can be done to make sure that migration has a positive impact on the end users. So rather than focusing on the actual movement of that content and the technology, let's focus on how we unlock the value of that content so that when end users get to a new space, they can effectively work a lot more efficiently. I thank everyone for their time and have a great day.